It's very important to avoid practices that get apps rejected from the App Store. Apple is very strict about the App Store. Apple exerts control over the app development and App Store ecosystem, and if you want to play ball in Apple's ballpark, you have to, well, play ball. No matter how many developers complain about Apple's rejection policies, more developers will always be willing to follow the guidelines. During the opening Worldwide Developer Conference keynote address in June 2010, Apple CEO Steve Jobs mentioned that over 225,000 applications were available. Now there are over 400,000. He also said that 15,000 applications are submitted per week and that 95% of all apps submitted are approved within 1 week. That's a pretty high approval rate. But just to be sure, it wouldn't hurt to know what was up with the 5% that did get rejected. It turns out that the majority of those rejected were rejected for one of the following reasons. The app didn't work as advertised, or the app downloaded and installed executable code, which is code that can run immediately on the processor, or interpreted code, which is code that can be translated to run on the processor. In either case, Apple can't review that code to make sure it doesn't do improper things. Another reason was copying Apple's existing functionality. Although you should use the functionality that's provided for developers, you should not simply copy something that Apple already does. Many web browsers, for example, which are apps that essentially show web pages and do little else, are particularly vulnerable for rejection. Another reason is if you stray too far from Apple's guidelines. For example, my app, Tony's Tips for iPhone Users, was initially rejected because the app used highlighting in a menu in a way that did not conform to Apple's guidelines. If you let a user highlight a row to select something or initiate an action, you'd better make darn sure that the row is deselected by the time it's displayed again, not still selected, as if you're reminding the user what was last selected. After fixing that problem, I resubmitted the app, and the app was approved. So be sure to follow Apple's guidelines, which are published in the iOS Dev Center. Another major reason for an app to be rejected is that it's crashing. Apple simply won't allow an app that crashes into the App Store. All these reasons sound reasonable, but in addition to these, you find a few other reasons why apps are rejected. Besides the typical rejections, mostly for bugs or improper use of artwork or trademarks, some apps have been rejected for pornographic images, and some were rejected for being too similar to Apple's own apps, while others fell into some gray area that Apple hadn't anticipated. For instance, apps that help people cheat at gambling in casinos. The important thing to do is to read the documentation, steer away from Apple trademarks and images, and stay away from content that's questionable in any legal sense. By keeping those things in mind, you can make design decisions about your app now before developing the app that can save you time and money later. The point is, Apple wants the user experience to be a rewarding one and consistent with the way Apple designed its own apps. Apple considers it an obligation to police the App Store and reject questionable apps, if only to build trust with consumers. Given the way that the iPhone and iPad can be integrated into your everyday life and communications, a malicious app could do considerably more damage than a similar one on a desktop computer. What other kinds of things will get your app bounced? Well, here are a few rules to develop by. Number 1 is not to use downloadable and installed executable or interpreted code. Apple rejects these apps. Executable code is code that can run immediately on the processor. Interpreted code is code that can be translated to run on the processor. In both cases, if they are downloaded and installed, Apple can't review that code to make sure it doesn't do improper things. For example, downloaded, executable, or interpreted code could mine personal information from iPhone users without their knowledge. The exception to this rule is code that is interpreted and run by Apple's published APIs and built-in interpreters. For example, Apple's WebKit framework. You can also include interpreted code in your app if you package all the scripts, code, and interpreters in the app without downloading them. The second big rule is to follow Apple's guidelines. The guidelines spell out how you should highlight things, select things, deselect things, and so on. One example of not following the guidelines is using an inappropriate keyboard type. If your app needs a phone number or other numbers typed in, it should present a numeric keyboard, not an alphanumeric keyboard that also allows people to type in letters, which would not be accepted. Another example of not following the guidelines is if you enable table cell editing without specifying which cells should be responding to editing controls and which should not. A third developer rule is to always warn the user of a lost internet connection. The iPhone and the iPad are all about using the internet. If your app uses a network connection, it is your app's responsibility to tell the user if and when his or her iPhone or iPad loses its network connection while using your app. For example, my app, Tony's Tips for iPhone Users, at first didn't warn the user if the user switched to airplane mode or otherwise lost a connection, and therefore it was rejected. I had to add the warning, as you can see on the right of the screen here, the not connected warning to Tony's Tips in order to get the app accepted into the App Store. In addition to development rules, there are also rules about marketing. First and foremost is to use in-app purchase for subscriptions. Apple offers the in-app purchase feature that developers can deploy in their apps to give users the ability to purchase virtual items directly from inside the app. For example, if you're developing a game app with multiple levels or environments, or virtual property, consider adding in-app purchase to your app to sell more levels, environments, or property. If you're developing a specialized book reader, use in-app purchase to sell books. Even if you're developing a productivity or travel app, you can deploy in-app purchase to sell additional premium features. Most importantly, you can use in-app purchase to sell a subscription to a content service or magazine-style app. With an easy one-click experience, a user can automatically renew a digital subscription. It's important to note that in-app purchase collects only payment. It doesn't download the content, add the game level, or hand over the virtual property. You need to provide the additional functionality, including unlocking built-in features or downloading content from your servers. In-app purchase supports three types of products: non-consumables, which are purchase items that do not disappear after using them. These include game levels, virtual property, characters, digital books and magazines, subscriptions, photos, and artwork. In short, any content that can be delivered within your app. A second type of product is consumables. Examples include virtual poker chips, in-game ammunition, or virtual supplies, such as construction materials. You can charge users for a one-time service, such as voice transcription, every time the service is used. A third type of product supported by in-app purchase are subscriptions, and these include magazine apps, music or video services, and online game portals that offer renewable subscriptions. Although the in-app purchase feature provides a general mechanism for selling products, everything else is up to you. You can't sell real-world goods or services. You can sell only digital content, functionality, services, or subscriptions that work within your app. Another marketing area that can get you in trouble are keywords. Keyword terms must be related to your app's content. It should be obvious, but some developers do it. You can't use offensive terms. It is a big no-no to refer to other apps, competitive or not. The third marketing rule is to not include pricing information in your app's description and release notes, and that free apps must be fully functional, not crippled versions of paid apps. It's tempting to publish a free version of your app with fewer features and then upsell the customer to the paid version. But in so many cases in the world of desktop computing, crippled free apps have been annoying and even misleading. It's not that Apple doesn't want you to promote your apps through your other apps. Apple just wants you to do it a certain way. The free version of your paid app must be a fully functional app. A free version can appear to be crippled with visually disabled buttons or sections. You also can't display the price of the paid version inside the free app. A free app can have fewer features than the paid version, but the free version must be a complete app in its own right, and you can't badger the free app's users with reminders to upgrade to the paid version. Tricks like these will result in Apple rejecting your free app. Also, you must use a different icon for the free and paid version of your app so that the consumers can easily distinguish between them. These limitations should not prevent you from deploying a free app that gently enables users to discover the paid version. Also, consider deploying a basic free app that offers paid levels or feature sets through the in-app purchase feature. You can always take advantage of Apple's iAds for Developers program and buy ads to promote your apps. In addition to marketing rules, there are graphics rules about putting your apps on the App Store. Number one is to use the same image for the app's icon and for the App Store page icon. This can be either a very similar or identical image in higher resolution for the App Store. You use a higher resolution version with more detail for the App Store page icon because that icon is shown in a higher resolution. But it must look nearly identical to the one that appears on the iPhone or iPad home screen. On the other hand, for free and paid versions, the app icons must be different. Use one icon image for the free app and its App Store page. Use another icon for the paid app and its App Store page. If you use the same icon image for both the free and the paid app, both apps go straight to the rejection bin. The third rule should be obvious, but don't use any part of an Apple image, and certainly none of the company's trademark images or names. Your app can't include any photos or illustrations of the iPhone or iPad, including icons that resemble the iPhone or iPad or any other Apple products, including the Apple logo. I've heard of projects being rejected for using the Bonjour logo as well as the Apple's network icon, that little picture of the globe with all the glowing lines. Your app can't include the word iPhone or iPad in its title, although in some cases it does work. For example, my app, Tony's Tips for iPhone Users, is okay because the app's content is about the iPhone. Note that if you use any of Apple's user interface graphics, you must use them in a way they were intended. For example, the blue plus button or add button should be used only to add an item to a list. Some developers rely on tricks, either to fool the rating system or to infringe on trademarks to get a little boost in marketing or whatnot. But these are stupid app tricks that will get you rejected. Number one is don't misuse the vibrate feature. You can't use continuous vibration in your apps. Short bursts as warnings are all that are allowed. Don't bother to try and set up a timer to keep the vibration going because the Apple folks already know that trick. Second is don't try to fool the ratings. Apps are rated accordingly for the highest, meaning most adult level of content that the user is able to access. If you hide adult content, they will find it, and if Apple's review indicates that the app's content is in any way inconsistent with the information you provided, out you go. The third rule is to not infringe on other trademarks either. Your app's title, description, and content must not potentially infringe upon other non-Apple trademarks or product likenesses. For example, I heard of an app rejected for using an icon resembling Polaroid photos. Finally, don't mention Steve Jobs. Apple will reject any app that mentions Steve Jobs in any context, even as a clue in a puzzle. And it does not matter how trivial the reference, just the name is enough. Before you upload your app and its data, make sure that you haven't run afoul of any of Apple's rules about trademarks, copyrights, and artwork, and make sure you follow the App Store approval process. You can find it at developer.apple.com/appstore/resources/approval. And for guidelines on how to avoid rejection due to coding or user interface issues, see the App Store Review Guidelines at developer.apple.com/appstore/guidelines.html. And what do you do after you submit your app? You wait for your app's approval or rejection, which comes by email. The time frame is on average about 2 weeks, although some developers have claimed shorter and much longer, and I can attest to taking only a week for my app.